Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're asking, is it a United Nations against ISIS? We've been debating it with Jacques Millard, who's a member of the French Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. We're also talking with Pierre Connaissat, the author of The Manufacturing of an Enemy or How to Kill with a Clean Conscience, and from Istanbul, Christopher Dickey, foreign editor of the Daily Beast. You heard the French president denounce the beheading of a French national, a tourist in Algeria. The news coming in a short while ago, this by a hitherto relatively unknown jihadist group that was making its mark. Just before the break, Jacques Millard making the point that it is up to Arab states to take a more front and center role. When he spoke earlier at the rostrum at the UN General Assembly, Barack Obama making a strong appeal to the Muslim world in his speech.
It is time for the world, especially Muslim communities, to explicitly, forcefully, and consistently reject the ideology of organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIL. It is time for a new compact among civilized peoples of this world to eradicate war at its most fundamental source, and that is the corruption of young minds by violent ideology. That means cutting off the funding that fuels this hate. It's time to end the hypocrisy of those who accumulate wealth through the global economy and then siphon funds to those who teach children to tear it down.
Christopher Dickey, who's he talking about specifically?
He's talking to the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the Qataris, the Emiratis. He's talking to the oil-rich Gulf states, first and foremost, not just to the governments, but to the individuals who are obscenely wealthy and decide that they can save their souls by funding these jihadis fighting some crusade, in fact, in the name of Islam. And I think that's a pretty direct statement by the president about how he feels about that. But at the same time, he's trying to enlist the governments of these countries to help him in the war against ISIS and the war against Al-Qaeda.
And how's he doing on that score?
Well, I think he's pulling them in. I think there is a realization that whatever was done in the past, and I think the other guests have pointed out that some of the things that have been done in the past to support Salafi jihadis, I think there's a realization now in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere that they represent a real threat, and even an existential threat to the House of Saud and to the other royal families of the Gulf. So I think that their interest in supporting them or having their subjects support them is waning very fast. The other country that's really interesting is Turkey, where I am now, where we saw that President Erdogan was very reluctant to get involved, not only because they had hostages, but because they were in a situation where, I'm sorry if there's a ringing on the line here, where there was a situation where he had hostages and he didn't want to compromise their situation. But at the same time, he was looking at ISIS flags flying right across the border from Turkey.
Let me interrupt you so we can hear the Turkish president. He spoke he spoke in New York as well, where he's due to speak as well to the UN General Assembly. Recep Tayyip Erdogan saying that he is considering, but he has to, of course, bring it up first with his government, logistical and military support to the coalition that's fighting ISIS inside of Syria. He also brought up the idea of a buffer zone inside of Syria.
A safe zone inside Syria is important, as we are sheltering 1.5 million people. This also has a negative sociological impact on us, and so needs to be solved. The third aspect of the issue is the fight against separatist terror organizations, which we should continue resolutely. The US also agrees with this. Within this framework, we can do our part.
Of course, Christopher Dickey, he's talking about separatist terrorist organizations. So there's something for everyone in those words, because he's obviously there referring to Kurdish separatists.
Yeah, well, it's a complicated situation, as we all know. But essentially what the Turks are saying now is, if you want our help against ISIS, against these groups, United States and others in the coalition, then you'd better tell us what you plan to do with our neighbor Syria over the long run. We've been fighting and supporting people who've been fighting against the Assad regime now for going on 3 years, more than 3 years. What is going to happen once ISIS is gone? We're not saying that ISIS is who we should be supporting to throw out Assad, but what are you going to do? And I don't think the Americans have come up with a very good answer, but the Turks are showing that they are interested maybe in doing more than a buffer zone. Prime Minister Davutoglu yesterday announced that he would go to the parliament here and ask for parliamentary authorization to use Turkish troops against ISIS in Syria. That doesn't mean they'll do it. Parliament may say no, or it may be arranged so Parliament says no. But that is certainly an important symbol because Turkey is the second largest army in NATO. It has 650,000 soldiers. So if it wants to make a move against ISIS,
Christopher, on that score, practically speaking, who can set up this buffer zone inside of Syria, and how would it work?
Well, the Turks will say that they need international aid to do it, and they'll obviously want logistical support and want help financially to do it. But at the end of the day, it will be the Turks who do it because they're the ones who have a massive army right on the border of ISIS territory in Iraq and in Syria.
Jacques Millard, now that those Turkish hostages are freed from the hands of ISIS, there was a handover that took place over the weekend. Those 49 mostly Turkish hostages. Would you say that Turkey's changing its tune and it's on board?
I would say that Turkey has played a dubious role in the past, and it's very difficult to understand where they want to go. First of all, you mentioned that those hostages have been freed. Why? Did they pay? What did they give to this
Erdogan says there was no monetary exchange, but he did hint at a prisoner exchange.
A prisoner exchange. That's not in the, let's say...
He didn't say it, but he hinted.
In the culture of those people, they don't make many prisoners, you know, and they don't care about their own people who are in prison there. So I will be very cautious with the attitude of Turkey, which has been a bit adventurous in the last years. Secondly, there is a big question which has to be put on the table, how Turkey is going to see and judge if the Turks in Iraq, in the Turks in Syria, and the Kurds in Turkey will join or not, because that's a big challenge for Turkey. And this is why I am very cautious. The point is that Bashar, we made a mistake at the very beginning. Everyone in the Western world said he's going to fall very rapidly, and he did not fall, you know, because he has a strong army, and he knew that if he was weak, he was finished. And we have it now. And of course, he has played a dubious role with those people. He freed them from prison, and my enemy of my enemy are my friends. So he played this it. And the Turks sometimes, you know, always played a dubious role as well. So I would say that today, I don't see how the situation will evolve. All I know is that this so-called Khalifa is certainly to be very friend with the Turks themselves. Because at the end, they are going to be in competition.
Christopher Dickey, we're getting more and more reports, and you and Pierre Conessa have both been talking about following the money in all of this. We've been getting reports that ISIS has made a lot of money, but so have the Kurds in, most notably, smuggling gasoline.
In smuggling ISIS gasoline, or diesel, in fact. A lot of people are making a lot of money in that smuggling racket, and the Turkish government has not been very effective, and some would say unwilling, to really shut that down. One of the tests, I think, that we'll have to see about the Turkish commitment to cutting off ISIS is going to be whether it really tries to crack down on that smuggling, which has been really extensive and has potentially over the course of a year earns ISIS about $1.2, $1.3 billion, which certainly makes ISIS the richest terrorist organization in history. So we'll see how that goes. But that has been a real problem. One of the things that the airstrikes are doing, however, is to begin targeting the sources of that diesel and the supply routes that are used. You know, they're very exposed. At the end of the day, if they're constant overflights, they'll be able to, whether they're Jordanian planes, American planes, French planes, whatever, they'll be able to take out a lot of that oil supply.
Christopher Dickey, we're going to be hearing in just a moment from the French president. He's about to speak before he heads to the rostrum, and we're going to listen in live to the French president's remarks right now. In fact, let's cross over to New York and listen to François Hollande.
Aujourd'hui, je m'exprime devant vous avec une émotion particulière, puisque l'un de mes compatriotes vient d'être assassiné
has just been the subject of a cowardly assassination in Algeria. Assassination by a terrorist group linked to Daesh or Islamic State. His name was Hervé Gordel. He was a man who was full of enthusiasm. He loved the mountains. And he thought that he would be able to pursue his passion moving into the Djoudjou area in Algeria. He was abducted and he was beheaded.
Voilà ce que le terrorisme fait.
This is what terrorism does.
Il ne le fait pas qu'à la France.
It doesn't do it only to France.
Il y a encore quelques jours, c'était américains,
just several days ago, there were Americans and British people who were dealing with the same level of barbarity. These groups and this particular group, Daesh,
ceux qui ne pensent pas comme lui.
They don't strike only those who don't think like they do. They also strike Muslims. They also strike civilian populations, and they strike minorities. They rape, they kill. It is for this reason that the fight that the international community needs to wage against terrorism knows no borders. And it is the same flag that needs to be carried, the flag of the United Nations, the flag of values for which this organization was founded: human dignity, freedom. The view we need to have on the world of tomorrow, one of justice. France is fully committed in this combat. It was in Africa when it was called on to go into Mali. Fortunately, it was joined by many African countries, European countries, now the United Nations. France has been committed each time there has been a danger. But today, this threat exists in Iraq and in Syria. It does not only concern this region, because this group, Daesh, has decided not only to conquer territories, imagining that it will found a state, but this group is threatening the entire world by provoking attacks, organizing abductions, recruiting fighters coming from all over the world to train them, to show them the barbarity that this group is capable of, so that they can repeat and reproduce this sinister terrorism movement in our own countries. Therefore, this threat exists not only for the region, but for the world. And it's for that reason that France has responded to the call of the Iraqi authorities, so that we can bring them first military assistance by providing weapons. This was done in August, but also now bringing aerial support to avoid this group, Daesh, continuing to progress. We want to weaken it, we want to reduce it. But we also know that while there is no settlement of the Syrian crisis, all of our efforts could be reduced, and that could mean not simply that there is an action against Daesh, but that there could also be a political solution. We in France support the democratic Syrian opposition as the only legitimate representation of the Syrian people. We won't change there, and we won't make any compromise, because there is the threat of the Bashar al-Assad regime, They also need to be condemned because they are complicit in what has been happening for the last few years in Syria. 200,000 people dead and just as many displaced. Ladies and gentlemen, France is going through a tragedy following the assassination of one of our compatriots. But France will never give in to blackmail, to pressure, to barbaric acts. Quite to the contrary, France knows what is expected. It knows that it carries these values. It knows that it has a role to play, and France will never renounce this role. And the fight against terrorism will be pursued, and it will be accelerated as much as is necessary with the respect for law, with the respect for sovereignty of states. We will make no mistake when we act. We will always do so with respect for the principles of the United Nations. Ladies and gentlemen, I would have liked to talk to you about so many other things. But please understand that in my country, there is nevertheless a great question which is being asked and which is being asked to you, and that is, when faced with these barbaric acts, faced with this terrorism, will we remain spectators? Or will we be actors together in what should be a just international order? This question, if we don't respond to it, or if we respond too weakly, then the terrorists will continue with their undertakings of indoctrination. It is not weakness that will be the response to terrorism, it is force. The force of law, the force of the United Nations. At a certain point also, the force of military action when it becomes necessary. Ladies and gentlemen, I also wanted to talk to you about other regions of the world which are also going through threats, which are threats to our own security. I wanted to talk to you about the Ebola epidemic because I know just how much it is affecting our African friends. But here again, let's look beyond those who are affected. Who can imagine that this epidemic can remain contained just in a few countries if we don't act? This is also a global threat, and here again the response must be global, and therefore France and the world must bring to those countries being affected by this epidemic the necessary care, the protection that is required, economic assistance that is expected. Because there again, if there is the slightest weakness, the slightest lack of solidarity, all of our countries will be affected. Ladies and gentlemen, I have also come here before you to speak to you about what is occurring in Europe, next to Europe, to what happened in Ukraine, with lacks there also of the principles of human rights. But even in Europe, what we need to do is achieve peace, and we see the ceasefire and the truce that has been concluded there, and this needs to be pursued. No continent is spared from this threat. Everything is fragile, precarious, vulnerable. And we need to have the same awareness of the risks and the dangers that beyond the Second World War, we need not only to make it a work of memory, but a task of the future we want, the world we want. And that is the last thing I want to talk about here, the world that we want needs to be one addressing climate change. But here again, this is threatening not only our generation, but the one that will follow us. It's a threat to our own security, because there are more people displaced by climate change than by wars, which are so intense and deadly throughout our world. Therefore, France has also taken on its responsibilities, having decided to organize a climate conference in December 2015. I'm very pleased to say that right here, thanks to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, there was a summit which enabled us to mobilize the will of states, financial institutions, countries, civil society. There were also many protests that took place because we want this conference to succeed, not only because it's in Paris, because it's the world that we want. There have been periods in history when we can decide not only for ourselves, but decide for humanity. And this time has come. Therefore, in Paris, we must do everything to make sure that a global agreement can be reached, an agreement that can be binding, that can be differentiated according to levels of development, which can have its green fund, to which France has contributed $1 billion for the coming years. And I hope that other countries will follow us, because we need this green fund to enable countries which don't have this level of development to be able to ensure their growth and at the same time their energy transition. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a sad moment that I'm experiencing today on behalf of France, that the French people are going through. But it is also a moment when we can move forward and take on our responsibility for the world, for the planet. We need to fight terrorism, we need to act for peace, we need to reduce inequalities, and we also need to do our job for future generations, to make sure that Paris is a success for the climate, and to make sure that the United Nations can always be faithful to the mandate that was given to it following a war, a horrific war. We are still facing challenges. We are certain to be able to deal with them if we are united, and together we can achieve this victory. Thank you.
All right, there you heard the French president saying we will not give in to blackmail this after news of the assassination of a French tourist in Algeria by a jihadist group. Here in the France 24 debate, we've been talking about it with Jacques Millard, Christopher Dickey in Istanbul, and Pierre Conessa. Pierre, the president at one point saying, you'll forgive me if I skim over some of the other broad topics that are on the agenda. Was that the right tone on the part of the French president, or is he giving too much attention to the jihadists?
No, I think that the President Hollande was exactly on his duty. I mean, he's the president of France, so he has to mention that event, which is an horrible assassination. So no one could understand that he could avoid this issue. No, the question is mainly. It will follow on an enemy which, I would say, global term is terrorism. But what does that mean, terrorism? Will we arrest Irish era terrorists? Will we arrest, I don't know, if it's possible to arrest Boko Haram, that's fine. But will we arrest Corsican people? That's stupid. I mean, terrorism is a way to act in violence. It's not a goal.
All right, a reminder of that this is all going to be a war that plays out in the media as well, and who wins the media war is important, and what terms you employ are important. Pierre Conessa, I want to thank you. I want to thank Jacques Millard. I want to thank Christopher Dickey for joining us today from Istanbul. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Much more to come.
T'as raison, moi j'ai été...
Phnom Penh revisited. From 1975 to 1979, an entire population was subjected to forced labor by its leaders. Massacres, executions, persecutions. Cambodians were the victims of the 20th century's third genocide. Although the wounds of the past still haven't healed, the country wants to turn a page. Led by a new generation that hasn't experienced this tragic episode of history, Phnom Penh is a changing city. Modernization is erasing all traces of the Khmer Rouge and the genocide. Phnom Penh revisited on France 24 and France24.com.